Hey, good morning, you guys. Moms, dads, kids, wherever you guys are in this world, welcome to your digital classroom. So the course title is entitled ACT English Mastery with the tagline of a proven roadmap to at least the 90th percentile. So guys, there's actually 4 things that I wanted to cover today as part of the agenda for this intro video. The first is the gap, second is the target, third is the curriculum, and the fourth is the who. And if you guys just stay kind of patient with me, these 4 points kind of work in a logical sequence that I think will help you to clarify whether or not this course is going to be for you. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and jump into the gap and really figure out what is he talking about, right? So guys, there's a lot that I don't know about you guys, right? So I don't get to see you face to face. I don't get to ask you questions. You know, there are certain things that I can kind of guess. You know, maybe you're Korean, perhaps. You're probably in high school, and probably you want a high score, right? But those are just kind of probabilities, right? So there's a million things that I don't know. But one thing that I do know for certain is that there's this, you know, where you are right now, right, isn't where you want to be, right? So I call this the gap. You know, so there's this space, right, between what your goal is for the ACT, specifically the English section if you're watching this video, and where your current score is, right? And maybe that gap is going to be different, right, for each and every one of you, depending on your starting point. But this is going to be something that's true for every single person in this world. And so, because you have this gap, you know, and I understand that this is an absolute truth, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. So because I know that is an absolute truth, I know that my role, right, my main role in this course isn't to be your friend. It's not to have you guys like me, right? It's not to try to impress you guys. It's none of that stuff. My goal for this course, or my role for this course, is to help you to close that gap. You can kind of help you to build that bridge, right, to make it as simple as possible for you to get to where you want to get to. So perhaps my role is as the gap closer, you know, and so you might be wondering, well, who am I? You know, what have I done that deserves, right, your attention? And so I did want to talk to you guys a little bit about myself, about who I am. So that's me. My name is Jin Bae. Most of my kids call me Jin Sem. Some of them call me Jin Teacher. Others just call me Jin or Hey You. Guys, I've spent the last 14 plus years, you know, teaching and working in Seoul, South Korea. You know, I've worked with over 7,000 students in two of the most academically competitive places in the world. Right? So that's Daechidong and Apgujeong. You know, I've taught pretty much everything, you know, the TOEFL, the ACT, IBs, APs, and I've also scored in the top 99th percentile on the verbal sections of many exams like the ACT, the SAT, and the GMAT. I'm also an author and a content creator. I've created thousands of practice questions that are really relevant to what you'll see on the SAT as well as the ACT. Plus I've written the book, maybe working on my second. We'll see. But I think really, you know, besides letting you guys just know kind of who I am, instead of just kind of yapping, I think it's much more important to kind of show you what I've done, because I think the results is really what you're after. And I think that if you really want something that you don't have yet, I think the best way to get that thing the fastest is to model, right, is to learn from somebody who has what you're after. You know, and so guys, this is just a little bit of a snapshot of the results that I've gotten for the ACT English section. So in February of 2023, so it's not photoshopped or anything, it's just screenshotted. There's my name, there's the date, and then this is the score that I got for the English section. So the ACT, each section is out of 36. That's the highest score that you could get. And I was fortunate enough to get a 36 for the English section. I didn't take the reading section seriously, so I blurred that out. And if you look at the breakdown, the details of the score, you'll notice that before 2025, the ACT English section was out of 75 questions. but now it's only out of 50, right? So these are the results for the 75 questions that I answered for this exam. So you guys will notice I didn't get every single question correct. I know, shame on me, right? But this is a very, very hard exam. I missed one. If you have older brothers or sisters that took the February 2023 exam, just a shot in the dark, they'll tell you that this test was extremely difficult. Some of my top scoring students who took this test, who normally score like a 35 or a 36 in the English section, they ended up scoring like a 28 or 29. So they were very kind of 깜짝 놀랐 too. And I could understand why, because even though the ACT was testing the very same sort of underlying concepts, the way that they were testing it, right, was very awkward. And I noticed that as well. So there was a lot more uncertainty for this test, even for myself, compared to other exams. But I was like, okay, Jin, well, I think you could do a little bit better than that, right? So a couple of months later, signed up for the April exam, took the April 2023 exam. Again, that's me. Here's the test date. And then I was like, well, hey, why not why not take a shot at the reading section as well, right? Why not take that seriously? And so didn't really study or prepare for it, but I took it seriously on the exam. And these are the results that I got in the April 2023 test. Now, if you look at the detailed breakdown of the scores, you'll notice that for the English section, 100, 100, 100, right? So I got every single question correct, yay me. And then for the reading section, I did miss one, right? Out of the 40 questions that it was out of back in the day. But that still led to a perfect 36, right? Perfect, whatever that kind of means. So that's really all to say, you guys, that I not only teach this stuff, right? But I also study for it or prepare for it like a student myself. And I took the test like a student, right? In fact, the April exam, I was in a classroom that I actually sat in when I was in high school in Hawaii. It was so weird seeing 20 students, right, who were like, my age 10 years ago, 25 years ago, just kind of taking the exam and me being there with them. It was a strange sort of feeling, but nonetheless, you guys, yeah. I think that I do have sort of the results as well as like the sort of knowledge and the insights about teaching as well, right? Having over 14 years of experience, working with over 7,000 students, that's really like the average teacher who teaches a 30-year career works with about 3,000 or 3,500 students. So I tell people that I have two teaching careers in less than half the time. Right, so to have somebody like that on your team who not only has the results, but who also has the experience, right, with teaching a lot of kids, maybe somebody you want on your team, right? So you might be wondering, well, okay, you have the score, but how is this class kind of structured? What is this class kind of all about, right? And that's really what the target is going to be for. So going into this, the question that I asked myself when I was designing this course was, what is the overall aim for this course? Like if I were to create a course, I have to have a certain outcome in mind, right? And so the outcome or the aim that I was really kind of targeting for the entire design of the course was to help you, wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever your level of English is, to help you to get fewer than 5 wrong consistently. So that was my entire mindset or my focus. That was like the focus when I was designing this course. It was like, well, is this going to help this person get this? Okay, then if it is, I'm going to put this in. If it's not, I'm going to leave that out though, right? Because maybe that's just for my pride or my ego or something. So everything is really designed with that goal or that aim in mind. And in terms of philosophically, right, the focal point, right, the focal point or the philosophical sort of focus of this course is really based on learning. And so you might be thinking, well, that's obvious, right? But, I do define learning in a sort of unique way. The way that I define learning is as a gradual process, right? It's a gradual process of acquiring, integrating, like making that knowledge yours, and then utilizing, like applying that knowledge, right, to develop skill. And the way that I define knowledge is in 2 main areas, right? So the first is what's known as objective knowledge. So this is just the stuff that's based on facts, right? This is how the English language works. This is the rule of grammar that you have to know. Objective knowledge is what regular teachers, most teachers will just teach in their classroom. It's basically what you have to know, right? And this stuff is transferable. In other words, no matter where you are in this world, right, you can actually pada or receive this based off of the lessons that I give, right? But there's a second type of knowledge that's not transferable. And so even if we were in the same classroom together, even if I was sitting right next to you, even if I was trying to think really hard to kind of put my thought into your head and make you do something, couldn't do it, right? So this type of knowledge, you guys, is only gained from experience. And that's called experiential knowledge, right? So this is the knowledge that you, whoever you are, wherever you are, you yourself have to gain by trying things out. Right, and that would be in the form of practice questions, self-studying, making mistakes, reviewing, reflecting, honestly assessing what you did wrong, what you can do better, right? That type of knowledge. And I think that this course really has the resources to help you to do both. So how this course is kind of designed, and I'll talk about the curriculum in just a second. In fact, why don't we kind of get into this? But how the course is really designed is it does have a focus, right? So we are going to focus on a concept, right? But then after we learn about that concept by giving you guys objective knowledge, we're going to then apply that knowledge by practicing questions. And there's going to be certain types of questions that aren't only like the ACT style questions, right? There's going to be certain sort of activities or exercises that you're going to do that's going to make you to apply what you just learned, right, in a way that'll help you to develop skill, right? So that utilization of knowledge, right, that you acquired through objective knowledge, right, through listening to and watching these videos, you're then going to work on practice exercises to help you to really develop the skill, right, to help you to make that knowledge sort of yours. And that really brings me to that sort of curriculum. So if learning and knowledge, if those are the philosophical sort of focuses of this course, then the curriculum here is really going to be the concrete, right? It's really going to be the down to earth, right? This is practically what we're going to do. And so the way that I designed this curriculum is I think it's pretty unique. It's really designed as a roadmap, right? So a roadmap kind of tells you where to go, right? So that we don't stray too far off path, so it kind of gives you a sort of path, right, to some sort of destination. And think about that destination as like your target, right? Like where you want to be, and so the way that I designed this curriculum is really taking learning in mind. I really think that learning has to be a sequence, right? So I broke things down as simply as possible, and then I built it back up in a way that I think is very logical and practical. And it's not just based on my thoughts, it's based on my experiences, right? Working over a decade and a half, right, with thousands and thousands of students. So I think I kind of have a sort of intuitive sense of how people learn and what style or what method of learning works best, right? Especially when it comes to multiple choice exams. That's an area that I feel extremely confident about in terms of how to teach it. And so this will be your sort of roadmap where the lessons or the knowledge that you'll gain will work as a progression, right, of information. So things won't be so hard for you. In fact, starting off, things might be extremely easy for you, right? But it's designed like that on purpose. It's because, right, the easy stuff is the foundational things that you need to know. And then from there, we're going to build on that foundation with more advanced things. But we can't just start with the advanced stuff, right? I think a lot of students just want to do the fun stuff, right? And they think the fun stuff is practice questions, But you have to learn the basics because the ACT reduced the number of questions from 75 to 50, which means that you don't have as many opportunities to miss questions, right, to receive a high score. And so if you want to get into that 99th percentile score, you're going to have to master the foundations. And that's what I think really mastery learning is all about. It's not about like knowing what Einstein knows, right? Mastery is really about mastering the foundations. Because once you have a super solid understanding of the foundations or the base of something, right, then from there you can kind of build on that base, right, by adding up or by learning more advanced things. But if you don't have a very solid base, right, and if you try to learn really complicated things, you're going to get lost along the way. And so this course is really designed with that in mind. And the overarching principle that I used, right, and not just in this course, but really as part of my life, I try to do that as part of my life as much as possible, is this principle here, which says, simplicity on the far side of complexity, right? So things are complex. Life is complex. The ACT exam is complex, right? We call this a high level of abstraction, right? So the ACT exam, if you just go sit in and take the test, right, it's going to feel very sort of complex to you. It's going to feel very abstract, right? You're not going to know kind of what's going on if you haven't studied it before, right? So this principle of simplicity on the far side of complexity, it's really trying to create a funnel where we're taking something that's very abstract and complex and we're breaking it down to make it more and more simple to reach this low level of abstraction. And that's when information gets really concrete. It gets really grounded. It gets really practical. And this is where things get really simple. Don't mean easy necessarily, but simple, right? And with simple things, right, built up a certain way, we'll be able to then build on that simple foundation and then understand how things work at that high level. And so that's really what the curriculum is based on this principle. So let me show you what I mean. So guys, this is what the ACT test makers kind of gave us in terms of what the questions will be like on the test. So if you read it, it doesn't really sound very clear. It's very abstract, right? Kind of sounds like it's up there. It's very broad, or you can't really imagine it. So for example, if I told you that about 20% of the questions on this test, we're going to test you on the knowledge of language. What does that mean to you guys? Right? So when you close your eyes and you think, well, what does knowledge of language look like? I think each one of us is going to have a very different image, right? So this is where information is very abstract. And so the ACT test makers, when they're creating this and when they give this to us, they're not giving this to us to try to help us. They're giving this to us because this is just the way that PhD, these test makers, right? This is just the way that they like to speak, right? They like to sound really smart, And so my job is to take this and then make it less and less abstract, right? So this is how I kind of do that. So taking this, I try to make the language a little bit more specific, right? A little bit more concrete based on concepts and question types, right? That the ACT tests. And so this is based off of not just grammar in general, but grammar as tested on the ACT English section. So there's 15 of these, and these sound a little bit more specific, right? So instead of something like precision of language use, right? Or I would say cohesion. Maybe if I said transition words, right? That's a little bit easier, right? But you have to use the precise transition words to show a logical or cohesive relationship between two sentences. Right? So this is more concrete. It's less abstract, right? So it's taking that and then now breaking it down, funneling it into making it something that's more specific or focused, and then taking those 15 concepts and then organizing it in a way that's easier for you guys, for every student, just to kind of imagine or visualize. So if I told you guys, hey, there's two main parts on the ACT English section. There's a grammar section. The grammar section will test you on punctuation rules and also rules of grammar, like grammar concepts like verbs, pronouns, sentence structure, run-on sentences, fragments, right? Now you'd be able to kind of like be like, oh yeah, I kind of know what the test is going to be about. And I said there's this other side. This is a little bit harder to understand. It's rhetoric, but rhetoric just means like the art of writing. It's how to like organize an essay or a passage. It's how to develop a paragraph. It's using words precisely, right? Using the correct transitions to show the logical relationship between sentences or paragraphs. Right? It's just really about the art of writing, right? It's how to write like a good introductory sentences for paragraphs. It's how to like recognize the best concluding sentence for a paragraph. You know, that's really that. So if I told you that this is what the test is about, compared to that first page, you guys would be like, oh yeah, this makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more concrete, right? And that's really what that principle, simplicity on the far side of complexity, is really all about. And I like to kind of create these. I'm not very good at design. I feel kind of chankpy sometimes about this, but I think that visual models are a wonderful ways to memorize things, right? Because instead of just looking at a bunch of words like this, right now if you have an image like this, right, and you are shown it kind of again and again, you'll be able to close your eyes or stare at a blank wall, and you'll be able to recreate this, right? We have two parts. What is that part? We have grammar and we have rhetoric. Underneath grammar, we have two buckets, right? We have the punctuation stuff, the foundations, I call it, and then we have the advanced grammar concepts, right? And so on and so forth. And so I'll incorporate these visual models throughout the course to make it easy for students to kind of memorize or learn. I found this to be extremely helpful during my first year of a PhD program, because when you're reading white papers, basically the research papers that academics kind of write, there's so many words, and so you have to be able to distill all of that and synthesize it into its most simplest parts. So I feel like creating models made it a lot easier for me to memorize or learn this stuff, and it allowed me to kind of learn a lot more instead of just memorizing words, because I forget a lot of those. But if I can memorize like visual images and visual models, it makes it a lot easier. I think that's something that I really try to incorporate in this course for you guys as well. So this course, you guys, even though the ACT English section has two parts, this course is really only focused on the grammar. The rhetoric portion of the course, right, is also for sale, depending on what you guys need. But I think that if you're new to the ACT, you should get both, right? Because this part also builds on the foundations that you learned here. Okay, you might think, okay, I'm better at this than I am at this, so I'm just going to get this. That'd be a mistake, right? Unless you're absolutely certain you can get 99 out of 100 questions correct for grammar questions, because really that's how I train students. I think you need this, because you want to be able to get every single easy question correct. For grammar questions, you want to get every single medium level question correct, right? And maybe miss a few kind of hard level questions, right? But if you miss an easy question on the test, your score is going to go way down, right? Because the curve's not going to be as generous for students who miss easier concepts, okay? So let's take kind of a quick peek, you guys, at how the grammar topics and subtopics are kind of laid out. So getting into this part here, so we have the building blocks of grammar, right, which is the foundation, and then we build on that foundation with advanced grammar concepts, okay? So here's what the building blocks of grammar entails. Now, the way that I designed this curriculum is really each chapter is going to focus on one concept, right, or one question type. So that'll be our focal point. But within that focal point, right, I'm also going to introduce other grammar concepts that we'll focus on later. But the reason I need to do that is because the English language is all interrelated, right? But then the good thing is we have a focus. So within this focus, we are going to be talking about or introducing other grammar concepts that might be focuses in later chapters. But that's how this course is going to be designed. And it's actually really helpful because it introduces you to these terms or concepts that you'll focus on later, right? But hearing it now, right, you might feel lost, but then the more you hear it, the more familiar you're going to get, so the easier it'll be by the time we get to focus on that chapter. And so the building blocks is really three parts to it. There's the 5 basic components of the English language, and then we have punctuation rules. And we can combine these basic components of a sentence, like an independent clause or a dependent clause, with various punctuation marks to create sentence structure. And so we'll cover all of the different ways or the subtopics that the ACT tests you on or tries to trick you and trap you on by creating grammatical errors, right, with these grammar concepts. So once we have that rock solid base or that rock solid foundation, then we're going to build on that with more advanced grammar concepts. So you can't only think about this as like the detail stuff, right? So if you're building a house, you know, the foundations is what we, you know, talked about, the punctuation, sentence structure. We have to have a very rock solid grammar base. And then from there, we can then build a fancy house, right? Make super nice windows, right? 15-foot ceilings, you know, so on and so forth, yeah? And that's really what the advanced grammar concepts are for. They're for more like the detailed stuff, the more specific things, right, is all. So again, within the concept of verbs, we also break that down into subtopics, like subject-verb agreement, verb forms, and verb tenses. And again, so these will have its own individual focuses, but then within that individual focus, you might hear me say things like pronouns, right? You might hear me talk about modifiers or adjectives, you know, things like that, you know. But that's really how this course is, and you don't really need me to cover all this, but you understand how the course is designed, how the curriculum's going to be designed is all. And so you really think about it. So the last part is, right, well, who is this course really designed for? You know, I really think it's designed for anybody who wants to brush up against their potential, right? So, you know, if you want to achieve a score that you didn't think was possible because you don't believe in yourself, right? You might want to take this course, you know, because you want to be with somebody who probably believes in you more than you believe in yourself. You know, and I believe in absolute change. I believe in human potential. I believe that change is possible because I've seen it. You know, I've seen it in thousands of students' lives, and I've also seen it in my life as well. So who I was 10 years ago is completely different from who I am now. And I'm sure who I am today is going to be completely different than who I am 10 years from now. I'm not just talking about externally, physically, but I'm talking about internally, right? My character, you know, those kind of things. So, but I know that I have to be a little bit more specific, so I can't just tell you everyone should take this course, right? So there are, I think, two sort of like main student profiles that I think that this course would be absolutely great for. You know, so I call those the untrained test taker. I wanted to say unskilled, but I didn't want to seem like I was putting you guys down, you know, and then also the unconfident English speaker. So these are just like objectively, I think that sort of type of student really I had in mind when making this course, right? So the untrained test taker, if we take a look at their profile, let's double click into it. So the untrained profile has these sort of characteristics, you guys. You know, I think that these are the type of students who don't really have a system. Right? Their thinking is very sloppy, it's disorganized, right? So there isn't any sort of mental framework or sort of sequence or procedures or processes that they use when they're solving questions. They just answer the question. That's what it is. So if you say, oh, how did you answer? You say, oh, I just answered the question, you know? These are untrained test takers, right? The people who score in the top 99 percentile on these tests, you guys, they're really precise. They're really precise with how they do things, you know. So there's a certain order that they approach or attack questions from. There's actually a certain way that these top 99 percentile students will read, right? There's certain intentions that they have in mind, you know. And so it's not just about answering the question, right? It's your approach. You know, and I think that if you have no mental framework, if you have no system of thinking or problem solving, then this course is perfect for you, because I'll teach you all of that stuff, right? Also, you know, if you're the type of student who maybe has some test prep experience, but you haven't been able to improve your English score, maybe it's probably because there's a lot of uncertainty that you feel when you're answering questions. You're not sure if this is the correct answer. Kind of think it is, but you can't really put language to it as to why. So you're just choosing your answers based on your feeling, as opposed to based on the facts, right? The objective knowledge that you'll gain from this course. This course will be right for you. You know, if you just need if you just want to be with somebody who's not just, you know, kind of nice or cares about you and your scores, but somebody who actually is an expert, right, that has the results that you want and the experience in teaching, working with students, you know, then I think this course will be good for you, you know, as well. In terms of the unconfident English speaker, this kind of person is kind of who he sounds like. Maybe you never took a grammar class in school. Maybe the only type of grammar lessons that you got was when your English teacher just kind of wrote red marks on your essay, but you didn't really take that seriously, and it's not a formal grammar class, right? So this course is not just a regular English grammar course, but it's a grammar designed specifically for the ACT English section. So you won't find some of the things that I teach in any grammar book in the world. You won't do it. You won't find it because it's precisely designed for the ACT English test, not just for the correct grammar rules, but also grammar rules that you want to avoid doing. All right, so these are called proscriptions and prescriptions. Proscriptions are things that you should do based on the rules of grammar. Proscriptions are things that you should not do based on the rules of grammar, right? So we cover all of those, but all within the focus of the ACT English exam. Maybe you're new kind of ish to the States, right? Maybe you've been there for a year or 2 or 3, or maybe you've been there for 5 years, but all you've done is just hang out with other Korean students, which nothing wrong with that, right? But your English skills probably haven't improved very much, right? And again, my whole focus isn't to be your friend or get you to like me or to impress you. My whole focus is to help you to get fewer than 5 wrong, right? And so got to be real with you guys, right? Got to be honest, right? Because our job is to learn, right? And so if you do want to take learning seriously, right? If you want to start to develop a little bit more of that self-belief, have a little bit more of that confidence in yourself that you can do it, right? This course is going to be right for you. And the reason is because it's designed, because it focuses on knowledge. Knowledge is the key, you guys, yeah? And unlocking the knowledge to help you to learn, to maximize your score, right, is going to help you guys to develop that self-belief. Otherwise, it's just fake, right? I mean, everyone's perfect, because you were created by, a higher power. So everyone's perfect as you are, but in terms of our abilities, right, maybe you might not have the ability, the belief in yourself, right, to get this sort of score or result, right? But that's really what this course is designed to help you to do, is to increase that belief in yourself by giving you the knowledge that you need, right, to develop the skill, right, to achieve or to maximize your potential on this test. So I hope that didn't take up too much of your time. It's been about 30 minutes. It's kind of how the classes feel. I felt like that was only about 10 minutes, but maybe you felt like it was 2 hours. I'm not sure. But anyways, you guys, I really thank you guys for taking this time to just give me your attention and your time. I know how precious that is. Really thank you for that. And I hope to see you guys in the digital classroom for this course. By the way, this is Bob, and he's going to be joining us, right, for some of these, for some of our classes. And Bob tells me to tell you, right, that you guys got this. Take care, you guys. Thank you. Today I really wanted just to kind of focus on the material itself, because after all, right, as students, right, our job is to focus on learning, right? So we want to leave all of that drama and our emotions out the door, and when we're here, we're here. Okay, so at this point, you guys, we're almost done here. We're going to talk about relative clauses, and this is an extremely important part of this chapter. So relative clauses do give students, a lot of students, high-level students, sorry, there's something in my eye, high-level students like yourselves, a lot of trouble. And I think it's really because we don't really know how they're created and how they're used. So what I'm going to do for you guys is really deconstruct, which means just to kind of break it down. So I'm going to break down a relative clause into its fundamental components, and then I'm going to build it back up to show you exactly, right, how to use these or how these guys are formed and how to determine whether or not they're used correctly. Because the ACT will, and I don't mean they might, I'm saying they will test you on relative clauses in multiple ways. So we'll go ahead and jump into that in the first part of the video, is that deconstruction, reconstruction process. And then in the second part, I'll talk to you guys about the who versus whom, which is also another area where most students, not just students, but even in native English speakers, they don't use these words correctly, right? So because you guys are at a disadvantage where English isn't your first language and you have to hear native speakers using who most of the time, and sometimes it's incorrect, you guys get that disadvantage, right? And I think that 95, 96% of people don't know how to use who versus whom correctly. So I'm going to break that down for you guys as well. And then the third part of this section or this topic, I'm going to talk about what I call funky relative clauses. Sometimes you might see relative clauses with prepositions in front of them. So we'll kind of, I'll kind of break down how to kind of work through, right, those types of relative clauses as well. Okay, so if you guys are ready, which I know that you guys are if you turn on this video, make sure that you guys do have your notebooks and a writing utensil. Make sure that you guys, have your, bring your attention, your positive attitudes, and let's go ahead and jump into this, you guys. So relative clauses, right? So what exactly, are relative clauses, right? So we're going to talk about some basic principles, and these principles are designed to, kind of start from the basics and then kind of build back up, okay? So first of all, we know at its core that a relative clause is just a type of dependent clause, right? So they're one of the three types of dependent clauses that I explained to you guys, right, in the first chapter of this course, the building blocks of grammar section. And we know that whenever we hear the word clause, right, we know that it must always have a verb inside of it, right? So I want you guys to circle that or note that, right? So this is probably about like maybe the 23rd time that you heard me say this, but it's that important. Okay, because one of the ways that the ACT will test you and try to trick you with sentence structure is that they'll create relative clauses or just dependent clauses without verbs in them, right? So you want to make sure it always has a verb inside of it, okay? Secondly, we know that relative clauses will always, because this will always appear after a noun, so circle that, right? And it modifies that noun, right? So these are going to be the placement of a relative clause. It always comes after the noun that it modifies, and its job is to always modify the noun that appears before it. So for example, if we had a sentence that said Bob adopted a dog that was injured, so we know the relative clause here, that was injured, refers to or modifies the dog, right? It kind of specifies which dog we're talking about. The third principle of a relative clause is that a relative clause is formed, right, with one of the 7 relative pronouns. So I want you guys to circle 7 relative pronouns. We know there's 7 of them in the English language, right? And so if you guys can kind of quiz yourself, this is a good thing to memorize, right? So we know it's who, whom, which, that, whose, W-H-O-S-E, when, and where. Okay, so we know that relative clauses begin with a relative pronoun, right? And that's how they're created. So when you have a sentence and you're identifying the components of a sentence, one of the things you want to look out for would be relative pronouns, right? Because you know that if you see a relative pronoun, right, chances are there's probably going to be some type of relative clause, right, that comes afterwards. So you know where that relative clause, that dependent clause begins in the sentence, which is important when you have to identify whether or not it's structured correctly. So the fourth principle here is that it says the noun that appears before the relative clause determines which relative pronoun is used. Okay, so we know that there are 7 relative pronouns in the English language, right? These are the 7. I wrote down whose twice, and you'll see why in just a second. But what this principle is saying is that the noun that appears before the relative clause, right? So it's going to appear here before the relative pronoun. That noun is going to determine which relative pronoun you use. Okay, so this is one of the things that the ACT tests you on. So you have to know, right, what type of noun can come before a relative pronoun. Okay, so we'll kind of run through this. So we'll kind of categorize it like this. So we'll group this as a group of 2, 1, 1, and 1. So when it comes to who and whom, you guys, right, who and whom are used to describe people. So the noun that appears before the who and whom has to be referring to a human being. Okay, of course it can be many human beings, that's fine. But if we have something like the student who or the writer whom, right, these would be okay. Okay? So people, right, have to come before the who and the whom. So of course, when we create a relative clause correctly, we also have to have a verb inside of it, right? So we could say the student who studies regularly or the writer whom the public loved. Okay? Now with that and which, that and which can be used to modify or describe things or objects, right? So if you have a person that comes before a that, it's going to be wrong. Now, in the real world, right, we say this all the time. I'm guilty of it as well. You say, oh, the student that, right? Or I'm the type of person that. Yeah, and that's actually incorrect. It's not standard English, right, as tested on the ACT. So whenever you see a person coming before these relative pronouns, you know it's going to be wrong immediately. That and which, right, when they're used as relative clauses, will always modify things, objects, things like that, okay? So here you could say something like the school that, or the book which. And we know that which is going to be always non-essential, so we have to make sure to put a comma before it, but that's not what this section of the topic is about, so no worries. But we are talking about relative clauses, and we know that in order to form relative clauses correctly, we always have to have a what inside of it. Always have to have a verb inside of it, right? So the school that Bob attended in middle school, the book which changed my life, right, has verbs inside of it. So when it comes to whose, you guys, this is going to be an interesting one. So I've mentioned this to you guys multiple times, and this is where we're going to dive into, you know, how this is created officially, right? So whose, W-H-O-S-E, not W-H-O''S, because we know that's a contraction that means who is or who has, but W-H-O-S-E is the only possessive form for relative pronouns. So we said there's 7 relative pronouns, and it has to be able to create a possessive, right? So whose is the possessive form of all of the relative pronouns. So what that means is whose can be used to modify people and, circle the word and, right, things. So I know this is where a lot of students think that, well, WHO, right, is used to modify people, so WHOSE must also be used to only modify people. That's not true. So whose can be used to modify a person, absolutely right. So you could say something like the boy whose, and it can be used to modify things or objects. So you could also say the book whose. And in order to correctly or grammatically create this relative clause, we have to have a verb inside of it, right? So we can say the boys whose parents are wealthy, or the book whose cover is torn, right? So, and here's the thing, you guys, right? So because who, hey kids, welcome back. So again, looking at our visual model here, we talked about relative clauses. We talked about the 7 relative pronouns, and the noun that comes before them determines what relative pronoun we use. We talked about funky relative clauses where we have prepositions that come before the relative clause. And so now we're going to dive deep into the who versus the whom, you guys. So this is a concept that a lot of students have trouble with. High-level students, really bright, hardworking students like yourselves. And it's no fault of yours. People in the real world, when they speak, when they write, right, will use these words incorrectly. And so I want to teach you guys how to use these words correctly, or how these words are used, how they're supposed to be used. And I'm going to teach you guys a strategy or a step-by-step process, right, that'll help you to determine whether the who or the whom is correct, right, all the time. Okay? So buckle up. Let's jump into this, you guys. It's pretty simple. There's a lot of practice exercises, and there's a lot of variations to how the ACT can test you on this concept. So we have to learn the fundamentals extremely well. So who? So we know that who and whom, you guys, are 2 of the 7 relative pronouns in the English language, right? Relative pronouns will create relative clauses. So what we know about who is that who will always function as the subject of the relative clause. So circle the subject, and it's going to be of the relative clause, not the main sentence. Okay? Because we know that the who is a dependent clause, right? So we're not talking about the subject of the main sentence or the independent clause. We're talking about the subject of the relative clause or the dependent clause. Okay, so for example, the athlete who broke the record trained for years. So who broke the record? The athlete, right? The athlete broke the record, right? So who is going to function as the subject, right, of this relative clause? Students who study regularly tend to perform better on exams. Well, who studies regularly? Oh, the students study regularly, right? So again, who functions as the the subject of the relative clause. What about for whom? Well, we know that, who will function as the subject, and then whom functions as the object of the relative clause. Okay, so understand this, like know this, memorize it, right? Associate who with the subject, associate whom with the object of the relative clause. So a couple of examples. The professor whom I emailed responded quickly. Well, who did I emailed whom? I emailed the professor, right? The professor is the object, right, of that relative clause. The actor whom the director chose was perfect for the role. The actor chose whom? The director chose whom? The director chose the actor, right? So the actor is the object of that relative clause. Okay, so that's what you want to associate, right? And that's going to be the fundamentals. Like that's the foundation here, right? And based on that foundation, we're going to be able to now figure out, right, whether who or whom is going to be used, whether it's used correctly in any given relative clause. Okay, so how we do that, you guys, is we use a particular type of test. Okay, and this is a test that we can apply, right, when we have a who versus whom question. So that test is fancifully known as the he versus him test, right, or the they versus them test, depending on the context of the sentence. Sometimes it makes more sense to use he, other times it makes more sense to use they, depending on if the relative clause is referring to a plural noun or a singular one. But we know that he and they function as just subjects of, of a sentence. And him and them function as objects, right? So we learned about this when we talked about personal pronouns, like case. So these are like the regular pronouns, and then the who and whom are like the not regular, right? They're the relative pronouns, the special type. So what we're going to basically do is, right, we're going to replace the relative pronouns with these regular pronouns and try to see what makes sense, okay? So how we do this is step number 1, right, is we want to identify the relative clause, right? And again, we have to know where that relative clause begins and where it ends. So again, what we're doing is we're tracking, right? We're identifying the components of a sentence, figuring out where it starts, and then tracking it to figure out where it ends, right? And so here, as a tip, usually, not always, but usually, the relative clause begins with the relative pronoun. We talked about this in the last video, but it's not always the case, right? So you just have to read it within the context of the sentence that you're given. So here it says, can you guys identify it? The athlete who broke the record trained. Well, trained is part of the main verb of the sentence, so it's going to end there, right? So who broke the record would be your relative clause. And again, you guys, the tip, just like because this is a relative clause, just like in the previous video, if you're not sure, you can read the sentence without what you think is that relative clause, and it has to be grammatically correct and complete, right? So if you say, the athlete trained for years, that's a complete sentence, right? But if you think for some reason, you think it ends right here, then if you read around it, you're going to say, the athlete, the record trained for years. You're like, what? Doesn't make any sense, right? It's no longer grammatical no longer sensical, right? So that's how you know you did it incorrectly, so you have to do it again. Okay, so this would be your sure-proof way to figure out or to know exactly where that relative clause begins and where it ends. Step number 2, right, is we want to replace the relative pronoun, right, with he and him. Okay, so we're basically kind of now taking the relative clause that we've isolated, and now we're replacing the relative pronoun, right, with he and him. Okay, and the second part of this step is our job is to create a sentence with the relative clause. Just like we did when we looked at relative clauses in general and the funky relative clause, right, we're trying to create a sentence with just the relative clause, right? But this time, right, we're replacing the relative pronoun with he or he and him. And we're comparing to see which one makes sense, which one creates a grammatical sentence. So again, you might need to rearrange some of the words, and that'll really depend on if the relative pronoun is being used as a subject or an object of the relative clause, right? If it's being used as a subject, we know that who is correct. If it's being used as an object, we know that whom is going to be correct, right? So how would we do that here? So we're just kind of comparing it, right? So what that looks like here is we would say that for the he test, right, we would say he broke the record. For the him test, we would say him broke the record, right? So now you're comparing it. What makes more sense, you guys? What makes more sense? Does it make sense to say he broke the record, or does it make sense to say him broke the record? Well, him broke the record makes 0 sense. It's not grammatical, right? So this third step tells you, right, if he makes sense when you replace the relative pronoun with the regular pronoun, right, then we want to use who. And that's because he functions as a subject, right, of a sentence. And we know that, we learned that from the previous slide, that who functions as the subject of the relative clause. On the other hand, if him makes sense when you apply this test, then we want to use the whom. That'll be our answer. Why? Well, that's because him functions as an object in a sentence, right? I cooked dinner for him, right? Bob gave him a book. It functions as the object of a sentence, right? And we know, we just learned from the previous slide, that whom functions as the object of the relative clause, right? So you see what we're doing, yeah? We're taking what's kind of more abstract or more concrete, more conceptual, more or less familiar to you, and we're turning it into something that you're all super familiar with, which is just normal, simple sentences. So that'll help you to determine, right, whether who or whom is correct all the time, right? So you will have no trouble here. Well, there's going to be some variations to how the ACT can do this. So it's going to take a little bit of time for you, but I promise you, again, I teach this to all students. Hey kids, welcome back. Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk to you guys about at the start before the explanation of dangling modifiers, is kind of give you this zoomed out conceptual overview. It's just very basic, but thought I'd kind of put that here anyways. So generally, modifiers, right, no matter if they're dangling modifiers or misplaced modifiers, modifiers by my definition is simply just a group of words that describe other words, right? Now, usually those other words are going to be nouns, right? But they could also be phrases, you know, that appear in a sentence, right? So they're nothing more than just a group of words that describe or modify. They refer to, right? So these are some terms, these are some verbs that you've heard me use, right? That's what kind of modifiers do. Modifiers can be of different types, right? So we can have, like, you know, we saw the relative clause as a type of modifier. We see prepositional phrases as modifiers. We can also see participle phrases as modifiers as well, right? So the general principle or the rule is that modifiers should be placed as close to the thing or phrase that they modify, right? So ideally, in a perfect world, we want to put modifiers, right next to the thing that they modify, right? The farther away that modifiers get from what they're supposed to modify, the less clear, right, and the more awkward the sentence's meaning becomes. You saw that example, right? Earlier here, the history paper was left on his study desk that Bob had written. Well, your job is to be aware or to notice, right, that we have a modifier here. I think that when you read this sentence, a lot of you would probably kind of have that sense or that feeling that something feels a little bit off, right? And that's that awkwardness or that lack of clarity that's created when modifiers are placed far away from what they're supposed to modify. And that's because, right, sometimes when this happens, when modifiers are placed far away from what they're supposed to modify, they're going to naturally be placed next to other things, right, that the modifier is not supposed to modify. And that's what kind of creates that awkwardness, right? When you read this indicates, or at least it sounds like, and it indicates that it was the study desk that Bob had written. Right, so if I ask you the question, what did Bob write? Right, what did Bob write? Right, this tells you that he wrote the study desk, but that doesn't make any sense, right? So this is an example of a misplaced modifier that needs to be placed in the correct spot, right? So the way that, the way that we would want to fix this, or I guess your job, right, your objective is to choose the answer that places the modifier in the correct place, right? So we want to say here, boom, right? So we would, it's kind of cool. We would recognize, we would recognize that it was the history paper, right? So what did Bob write? Well, Bob wrote his history paper. So do we want to put this modifier close to, right, the thing that it modifies? Right? The idea here is that, we don't live in a perfect world, right? So we can't always create sentences where the modifier is right next to the thing that they modify, right? But we can try. Or on the ACT exam, right, you have to choose the best answer among the four. So what does that tell you, right? So one of the things that I love about multiple choice exams that I think make it really conquerable, right? It's easier to master multiple choice exams than it is to master an essay exam, because multiple choice exams, right, you have an answer that has to be unequivocally, without a shadow of a doubt, correct, right? And so what you can do in cases with misplaced modifiers, right, is you can kind of compare answer choices. Well, what do you compare them on? You can compare them on how it sounds. You can compare them on grammar, sure, but you can also compare them based on how it sounds too, right? So now a lot of times, like you guys have seen, we can get to the correct answer by crossing out wrong answers that are wrong because they violate grammar rules, right? Well, what happens when we have two answer choices that are left and there's no grammar rules that we can use to eliminate an answer? This happens sometimes for certain question types. We'll encounter more of these when we get into the rhetoric section of this course. When we talk about diction, right, prepositional phrases, like there are no grammar rules for those concepts. So what do we do in those kind of cases? Right, well, what we do is we have to choose it based off of logic, right? We have to choose it based off of just our natural ability to comprehend and understand the language, right? And so that's one of the sort of markers that you could use, right? When you're determining or comparing two answer choices, you can compare them based on how they sound. Which one sounds clearer, right? Because again, at its most basic level, when you plug in the correct answer back into the original passage, the correct answer will always, not sometimes, but always produce a meaning that is grammatical meaning that it follows the rules of grammar, but it'll also produce a meaning that is clear, right? That is easy to understand, right? Especially when you compare them to incorrect answer choices, okay? And so that's the thing that I want you guys to kind of like understand, and that's what you have to kind of like notice. I think that's a key, right? The key thing to notice and do is comparing answer choices and then noticing which one kind of sounds clear or creates a clear meaning. That'll help you guys a lot with misplaced modifiers, okay? So with that being said, y'all, here's your visual model again. Let's unconfuse Bob, right? Let's basically untangle those knots of confusion that are in his head. And let's talk about misplaced modifiers. So what I mean by placement or placed, misplaced, you guys, is just where this modifier appears in a sentence. Does it appear next to a certain word? Does it appear in the middle of the sentence? Does it appear at the end of a clause, right? That's what placement is, right? Just simply put, where it's placed. And this whole point is basically saying, this concept is saying that placement matters. It matters where you place things, right? So yeah, that's kind of what we'll talk about, right? So general principles of misplaced modifiers. We know that this is going to be that second type, right? That other type of grammatical error when we're dealing with modifiers, right? And there are certain conditions, 2 of them, right, that exist when we have misplaced modifiers. So the first principle or the first condition is that the modifier is placed too far away, circle that phrase, too far away from the word it's supposed to modify, right? So that will create confusion and often illogical or ridiculous meaning. Okay, now sometimes that modifier, because of the way that the sentence is written, has to be placed in a different place in the sentence, far away from what it modifies. But in those cases, right, there's going to be punctuation marks that kind of indicate to you, or at least that's what they're supposed to do, right, that this modifier is actually modifying something that's far away. So we also have to make sure, right, that modifiers are properly punctuated, right? Because one of the, again, one of the conditions for this type of modifier is that 어쩔 수 없게, right? Because it is kind of what it is, we have to put the modifier far away from what it modifies. And that's basically how all of your answer choices are kind of given, right? But if they're not properly punctuated, then those would be incorrect as well, right? That'll violate the rules of grammar because it'll violate a punctuation rule, okay? And so guys, so the second thing too is basically this comparison, right? So when your job is to choose one answer among 4, one of the things you can always do is compare, right? You can always compare answer choices, okay? So especially for misplaced modifiers, you might be able to cross out 1 or 2 answer choices immediately, but for the remaining ones, you might not be sure, right? Based off of maybe you don't know a grammar rule, or maybe there is no grammar rule. So how do you determine the correct answer or the best answer? Well, you compare it. You compare it based off of how it sounds, right? Because we've said one of the characteristics of misplaced modifiers is when they're misplaced, they're going to make things sound awkward. Right, things will sound off. I like to use the word clunky or off. Hey kids, okay, welcome back. So we covered the conceptual parts for these 2 types of modifier questions that are based on errors of grammar. So now we're going to jump into utilizing what we learned to develop skill. Right, so one of the things that I want you guys to notice about modifier questions is just the way that they can be asked, right? So sometimes you might have the entire independent clause underlined. Okay, that's one. So these answer choices tend to be longer than other answer choices, where you have like, a transition word, or you have a verb, right? Like one word. These are longer. They could be complete sentences, independent clauses. Also, this is what I want you guys to notice. Notice the first words in the answer choices, Okay, we have the suspect, a confession, the suspect, the attorney, right? So notice how we have different nouns that begin an independent clause, right? So we have different subjects, right? So that characteristic, right, is a key indication that you're going to have a modifier question, okay? Particularly a dangling modifier. Because if you have different nouns or different subjects at the start of your independent clauses, right, and we talked about it, we learned it in the last lesson, that dangling modifiers, right, basically have the wrong subject, right, that's placed after the modifying phrase. Putting two and two together, you could be like, oh, man, this is a modifying phrase question, right? So how do you deal with that? Well, I said we went through the steps, right? So we read the sentence the first time through and make observations, notice things, right? So after discovering a vital piece of evidence that clearly placed the suspect at the end of the crime, the suspect was forced by the prosecuting attorney to confess. Okay, so I notice a modifying phrase here, right? And I understood the sentence, yeah? So now I'm asking myself this question. Who, here it makes sense to say who, right? Who discovered a vital piece of evidence that placed the suspect at the crime? Who discovered a vital piece of evidence that did this? So that's going to be the answer to the question, right? So take your time. The logical answer should be what? Good. It should be the attorney, right? The attorney was the one who discovered a vital piece of evidence, right? It wasn't the suspect, because how could the suspect discover a piece of evidence that put the suspect at the crime? What? Does that make any sense to you? No, this is illogical, right? It actually is absurd, because basically the suspect is going to be incriminating himself. He's going to be basically saying, hey guys, I found this piece of evidence. It was me. I did it. No, we don't want that, right? So we know that that's not going to be okay, right? And then a confession can't discover something. A confession is something that you say, it's an admission of guilt, right? I was wrong, I did. But it's a statement. So a statement can't discover anything. So this is why D would have to be the correct answer, okay? So that's what you do. That's the steps. So if you notice, you guys, you have a dangling modifier question, you can answer these questions within 10 seconds. They save you a lot of time, and you know for sure you got the correct answers too. So how good does that feel? When you can solve a question in like 10 seconds and you know you got it correct. It's a pretty awesome feeling, right? On the way, so same things too, right? Notice the beginning of the answer choices, right? The beginning part. So if you just kind of look at bird's eye view, let's zoom out a little bit, and just kind of look at the beginning parts of each of the answer choices. What do you notice? You can notice differences in the beginning of the answer choices, right? We have the independent clause that's underlined, and we have different nouns or subjects that start the independent clause, right? So, ooh, dangling modifier, perhaps. So if you're aware of that before you start reading, super powerful. Because now when you're reading, you're going to be asking, you're going to be kind of observing. Of course, you're understanding the sentence, but you know you're going to be answering the question here, right? So on the way to attend a study session at Cook Library, the oldest library in the state of Hawaii, a taxi driver nearly hit my friend Meredith. So I could ask you the question, you guys. This is your modifying phrase, right? Who was on her way to attend a study session at Cook Library? So we know the logical answer has to be, good, it has to be my friend Meredith, right? But here, this sentence indicates that it was the taxi driver that was on his way to attend a study session at Cook Library. But guys, let's be real, right? A taxi driver's job is to drive the taxi, right? Is the taxi driver really attending a study session at Cook Library? Based on the context of this sentence, no way. So this is illogical, right? Doesn't make sense. Same thing here as well. This is the taxi driver, an old man driving a taxi. And then also I want you guys to watch out for this impersonal pronoun, right? It nearly happened were my friend Meredith. So even though Meredith is placed before the taxi driver, this isn't the subject, right? It is the subject, but it is an impersonal pronoun, right? So we know that those would be incorrect. So I like B here, my friend Meredith. Look at it. Can you guys see it now? Right? Boom. Adam, Adam's doctor. So notice how they're going to put, possessive nouns as an answer choice. Right? So that's something I want you guys to notice, right? It's the doctor, that's the noun. It's Adam, it's the school, it's the doctor's note, right? These are the different sort of nouns that are placed at the beginning of the sentence. So here, having been absent from school for almost 2 weeks, Adam's doctor's note was sent to the school. So guys, who was absent? Who had been absent from school for almost 2 weeks? Well, we know that has to be Adam, right? The school is not absent from school, right? What? Doesn't make any sense. Adam's doctor's note. How can a note be absent from school? Right? Adam's doctor. How can a doctor be absent from school when the doctor is a profession who finished school? Right? It's got to be Adam here. So the logical answer to that question, you guys, has to be placed after that modifying phrase. Notice it. Can you guys see it? The police, my call. And of course, you can have the same nouns for some of the answer choices, but if you notice, differences between 2 or 3 of the answer choices, it's a very good indication that you're going to have a dangling modifier question. So, frightened by the strange noises downstairs, which sounded like footsteps and clanking sounds, the police was called and on its way while I waited in my room. So guys, who was frightened, right? Who was frightened by the strange noises downstairs? It's going to be me, right? I was the one who was frightened, right? Not the police, not my call, right? But it was me. So now I'm down to C and D, right? So now what do? Right? Well, you plug it into the sentence and see which one is grammatical and then which one makes sense, right? So it says, I called the police waiting in my room versus I called the police while waiting in my room. So this answer choice indicates, let me ask you guys this question. Who was waiting in my room? Logically, it has to be I. Right? Well, C says it was the police that was waiting in my room. But when you say, I called the police while waiting in my room, now this indicates that it was I, right? Because if you think about it, if you say, I watched TV while studying, right? Versus I watched TV studying. So without that while, right, it indicates that it's like the TV that was studying. But when you say, I watched TV while studying, who was studying? It was me, right? I was doing this while doing that, right? So this is why I want D here, because we have the correct modifier, that this modifier now is modifying. Cool. So look at this question, you guys. So the best placement would be where, right? So our job is to place this modifier somewhere in the sentence, right? The best place, okay? So how you do this, don't rush it. First, ignore this and then read the sentence, right? So it says that the movie director hoped, okay, before we do that, we can actually just look at what this phrase says. In fewer than 3 takes probably tells us like when something happened, perhaps, right? I'm not sure yet, but it just kind of tells us like a time. Right? Something happens in fewer than 3 takes, okay? So noticing the type of modifier that